Greetings all, and welcome back to these seemingly very periodic Mgtow talks. I'm here again with my friend, biochemist and master of minerals, and we are going to talk about, what are we talking about today?
Self-esteem, motivation, sense of self, that kind of thing.
That kind of thing, right? And having said that, I'm going to give the podium to my counterpart right away, and we can all listen to what he has to say, and I will respond. So, yes, the podium is yours.
Excellent. Okay, so there's something that had troubled me, I guess, was recent videos of Mgtow content producers who've said essentially that Mgtow is a shedding of the ego. You know, Barbarossa had said this, and you recently had the zoom out. Yeah, that's what I want to call it. The zoom out thought experiment that was your last video, and
Hmm.
I think that there can be a bit of confusion sometimes with what's meant by the self and what
Yeah.
identity is, and these
Yeah,
kinds of things.
and that's absolutely, and we were just privately talking about that.
Yeah, and so uh, the uh, would you like to talk about the three camps of the sense of self, the libertarian, the
Well, that they're sort of free will camps, but I suppose it's more relevant. But why don't we first start by talking about what most people mean when they think of identity and self, which was not what either you
right,
meant or what I meant. As I
right,
said, I can kind of get on board with much of what you're saying. What most people think of when they talk about self and agency and free will and matters of these sorts is this kind of continuous I that, as you suggested, is free from uh, outside influences. I mean, nobody
No, I
actually.
didn't suggest that. I suggested that the libertarian,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
you
no, no,
as you
exactly.
put it,
That's you suggested that that's what they think, and
right.
I
That's
think
not my position.
I no, I'm not saying it's your position. I'm saying it's the position of these other people. Most people, the majority of people, 90%, whatever. That's what most people think and believe to be their selves. There's continuous I, and you and I talked about the notion of emergent properties within complex systems, and the human being one of those, particularly with regards to emergent properties of the brain. And consciousness is, in fact, an emergent property. And how we have to acknowledge that within a complex system, particularly with respects to humans, our complex system, the brain in this case, you take away one little bit and you're going to be losing a lot of self, if you will. And I think most people don't think of the self or identity as an emergent property, a byproduct of a complex system within even more complex systems. They're not spending their time thinking, if I didn't have those microbes in my gut, I'd be dead. They're thinking of this sort of almost like a soul, a sort of disembodied I that just kind of exists unto itself. And as you and I believe correctly identified, it's a patent denial of what reality actually is. So
Right.
that's neither you nor I are talking about that. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, hopefully, we can talk about how we might perceive a self to be or a lack thereof. So take the podium again.
Okay. So the idea that it's multivariable, the inputs to the system of the self, it's not this independent, autonomous thing. It's got a lot of stuff working underneath the surface. There are a lot of things at and below the kernel level, if you want to use a programming analogy, right? There's the machine language of the individual neurons, and even below that, I mean, there's the biochemistry of it. And I had mentioned when we were talking previously about how the vast majority of a person's serotonin isn't actually in their brains. It isn't stored in vesicles awaiting to be released in the synaptic gap. Now, in fact, most of your serotonin exists in your intestines and is produced with the help of the flora of your gut bacteria, your microbes, and all that. And it's interesting, I think, how much a person's mood can be affected, let's say, by what they eat. Just one instance. So the individual, yeah, I mean, to use the word individual, to divide, you cannot divide these things out, right? If you took the bacteria away, you would, well, you'd be sick for one. You'd have horrible diarrhea, and you wouldn't be able to produce the serotonin that your brain needs. You'd probably die very quickly without these bacteria. Uh, but so, like, we don't think about that as part of the individual. You divide out the bacteria in your gut, you're dead, right? You divide out your prefrontal cortex, effectively you're a vegetable, right?
Yeah,
Right.
you damage, Broca's area, affects speech processing, and same thing, same principle. Yeah.
Right. So the concept of the individual is a lot more complex and far more nuanced than people give it credit for. And the idea of that we're free from all of these influences, it's a rejection of reality. Because, I mean, yeah, you don't have to acknowledge the truth of reality. You don't have to acknowledge the gut bacteria, let's say, because I mean that's my favorite example right now. But you don't have to acknowledge the fact that you have to eat and maintain these microbes in your intestines. You don't
Well,
have to
yeah,
do
you
that.
don't have to acknowledge having kidneys until they, fail to work and you have some problems.
Right. Well, you don't have to do anything actually. I mean, in some sense, you could, if you wanted to, stop breathing, and then there's
You can meander through life without thinking about any of this, and some people choose to do so.
go on autopilot. Yeah. Uh,
Well,
right. And
exactly. I think what we're talking here about is another aspect of we can have a conversation about identity, but it can't be one that's bound up by convention, which is then this sort of it's almost the autonomous soul, right? There's some
right.
quality that makes you the high lord of minerals, and it's sort of floating in the ether, and that's you.
Like
And
some platonic ideal.
yeah, and it's not really affected by stuff, and that's just you, and then there's Stardust, and that the quality is me, and and I think that that's just rank nonsense, obviously, but unfortunately, that is the general. I wouldn't even say consensus. That's just the feeling people have, and people tend to go with the gut. Go with your gut, right? Terrible, terrible instinct, actually. It's. I think it's part and parcel of just how much we are on autopilot. That is generally regarded as a positive assurance or a positive saw, if you will. Go with your gut. It's a nice thing. You just go with your instincts. This is a positive thing. You got to trust your instincts. I mean, it's seen
you,
when you actually think about it, it's absolutely absurd, right?
yeah, you don't have to trust your gut, and in fact, sometimes it's better not to, because
Yeah.
those bacteria, as much as I love them, if you do just what they tell you, you'll I don't know, get really gassy. You'll be like overweight and all these things. The bacteria don't have, in the larger sense, your best interest in mind. They have their best interest in mind, and just like any number of things, it's not
Certainly, I would agree with that. I was thinking more about the saw or the phrase, "Oh, go with your instincts."
right. Right,
The
your
notion,
instincts might
right?
not have your best interest in mind,
Precisely,
right?
precisely. And I think you see this. You actually see this line of argumentation recurrent in a lot of comments I see. I mean, one comment I saw recently, perhaps on my most recent video, it might have been another one, is that no, but Stardust, you're missing the point. All of these emotions are part of being human, and da da da. And you'll often hear what I like to call the argumentum ad humanum. The argument from the human that if it's human or belonging to the realm of the human, it's great. I mean, it's the naturalistic fallacy in some sense, right? Everything that occurs in nature is somehow good. If we're feeling these rabid and sometimes very dangerous and damaging emotions, and we just got to go with it. Just go with the flow. And
Emotions are a tool.
a
They're
tool,
they're
yeah,
just a
they're a
tool.
tool, and I'm just not on board with this idea that we should just go with it. Your instincts or your microbes don't always have your best interests at heart.
I, l-
They don't really
I
have
like
hearts, but
that we
yeah,
take it back to the bacterial level. Like
yeah.
it's very primal. I mean, that's primal. You can't get very much more primal than a single celled organism, right?
No, no. I mean, they were around a lot longer than we were. So
Right. So the connection of the primal instincts, right? Yeah, it is. It's a very basic thing. It's necessary. I mean, you would not exist without these primal aspects. But the idea is that there's more to it than just those base units, right? There's the emergent property of the self, and I think that's uh, a bit of confusion, right? Because it is a very complex system with a lot of inputs to it, and that you get this network effect, this to wax poetic, this jewel on the top of the mountain, or the crowning piece of reason that governs the system of you, I guess. Uh, right. Enough waxing poetic, but the idea is
yeah,
that
yeah,
it's not just the basic, but it's also not just the jewel. It's it's a combination of both, and I think that was where we had left off before we got
yeah. I
onto this
mean, I was
conversation.
saying that I might be able to get on board with a definition of some sort of extant self that is dependent upon emergent properties and an enormous layer of complexity that itself sort of folds into more layers of complexity and so on and so forth. But once again, that would almost certainly not be the self that most people think about, or the identity that most people think about when they think of themselves. And and in fact, in that regard, I think you're much closer to the camp, well, my camp, than the conventional camp. So
Well, for
I'm
the audience, could you, because we talked about
right, right,
your
right. So you know, it's inextricably linked to the idea of self or notions of free will and what have you. And generally speaking, there in the philosophical aspect of it, there are three camps or schools. You have libertarians; these are not political libertarians, although I suppose they could be, who believe in conventional ideas of free will, which are probably most lined up in my interpretation with the people going with the gut instinct, or the soul in the ether. There's this I somehow, and it's dependent and yet somehow also independent of all this other stuff, and yeah, and I think that's just kind of
Well,
patent.
I wouldn't say that because if it's dependent and not
Well,
dependent,
I
then
think
that's the
because people,
compatible.
it'd be because no, I say this only because people would be extremely hard pressed to concede, would say something, or to say rather to say something along the lines of course I exist independently of all of these other things, the fluids I consume and blah blah blah. I mean, you would have to be. I mean, I don't know who would claim that. That's why I said that.
Delusional. You'd have to
Yeah,
be
you would have
delusional.
to have some sort of mental lack, but in any event, these guys believe in conventional definitions of free will. A lot of it's quite Christian. Saint Augustine, way back in the fourth century, he talked quite a bit about this stuff. And it's yeah, it has a lot to do with this ethereal sort of soul business and what have you. Now that just can be dismissed, I think, fairly quickly because the stuff we were just talking about. It seems pretty obvious that's not the case. Then you have people who are kind of in my school. And I just don't. I mean, certainly the conventional ideas of free will are just, they're obviously wrong. But and so I would just describe myself as someone who just doesn't see that at all, and consequently rejecting the conventional perception of self. Okay, there are also people, and not necessarily calling you that, called compatibilists who still try to find wriggle room, if you will, for an idea of free will, but they acknowledge all of the, say, complexity, if you will, and the interdependence and the causal links, and still characterize, say, decision making and action as some kind of agency on your part, and thus the preservation of free will continues, or what have you. And none of these guys, to date at least, well, certainly people have talked about consciousness as an emergent property, but I think what's most interesting is that I might be able to temporarily, or at least partially, get on board with a definition of self that acknowledges that self is nothing if you take away the tiniest sliver of the complex system that gives rise to it.
Hence, individual.
Hence, individual. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so just to clarify some stuff there, I think it's good that neither of us are talking about the usual,
Platonic souls and all that.
I guess you could. I guess a really shabby way of putting it, sort of me syndrome, but yeah, that kind of thing.
Well, and so something else that we had talked about was the kind of I would agree that's illusory, that's delusion. I mean that it's a fundamental rejection of reality to kind of just sidestep reality and say, oh no, I exist kind of in reality and yet not.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
that's a rejection.
yeah.
That's delusion. And just on a quick aside, I love that you used the word nonsense because the physical reality, physical world, is sense. It has sense data, right? The physics,
Well,
right? You
yeah,
can measure things
yeah, yeah, yeah.
either directly or indirectly, right? And the idea of the supernatural, that which is outside of our natural world, outside of the laws of physics and natural law,
Hmm.
that's not sensible, right? You can't build a sensor to say, oh yes, we measured the soul and it's exactly 5 grams and has these dimensions. No, you can't do that. You can't build
There
a
are
sensor.
so occasionally, by the way, there are some really strange people out there who I mean, even Daniel Dennett. I'm sure you know who he is, right? The
Only vaguely.
Right. He's quite a very well known philosopher who talks a lot about free. He's a compatibilist, by the way. Free will and the nature of consciousness and religion and what have you. And he's so invested in, say, giving the faithful still some, I wouldn't even say some hope, but some ideas. You do have a soul, but it's a soul made of little robots. And then, do we really even need to use
Can
this
you
term?
measure the robots?
Well, that's the thing. I guess you could, and you could. I mean, you can measure brain states. You can measure, blood pressure. I mean, you can all these things, and so all these little robots adding up to the big robot or the big soul. But I just thought I'd mention that as an aside. It's kind of funny the way he puts it, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I love that you use the word nonsense because it really is something that cannot be sensed, cannot be measured. And I love the Galileo quote. I might be misphrasing it, but measure that which is measurable, make measurable that which is not so. And
Yeah.
that's the goal of science, basically.
Yeah, I always thought Galileo, along with Newton, I mean, these guys were religious lunatics in addition to being scientific geniuses. But yeah, the dichotomy of the mind. Yeah.
Well, it was. We hadn't had Francis Bacon long enough, and we hadn't had the
Well,
scientific method.
but it just goes to show that this compartmentalization effect can be quite potent. I mean, arguably Newton spent more time on the arcane art of alchemy that I like to use in fantasy games, but acknowledges being nonsense in reality, and biblical prophecy than he did on actual physics. In fact, I think he did spend more time on that mumbo jumbo. And so yeah, people can believe all kinds of strange things and at the same time be spot on about certain things. That once again, it's just these great minds of the past. They always strike me as well, they're men of that sort.
Yeah, well, it was a younger species, I guess.
Or
I would say.
Francis Collins, the former head of the Human Genome Project, who was an evangelical Christian. So there you go.
Yeah, that one hurts.
Yeah, yeah,
Personally, as a biochemist, that hurts.
yeah. Well, yeah. He's also a
Pride.
medical doctor. He's got a lot of
Uh,
qualifications.
but in any case, so the nonsense really is the supernatural, right? So I don't really deal in nonsense, and you can try and debate how many angels can fit on top of the head of a pin or whatever. But I would just excuse myself from those kinds of conversations. I don't deal in nonsense, and I think I mean, most of your audience hopefully is in that
Well,
camp. Or
I think they are, and if they're not, then I'm not here to bootlick, so that's fine.
right. So uh, going back to the overall topic of the
Yeah,
sense of self. So I firmly believe that the self is an emergent property of physical systems. It's a dynamic system. There's no continual self. It changes with time, with new information, new stimuli, new inputs, right? It's a multivariable system. Uh, there are deterministic parts of it, and there are indeterministic parts of it. There's a degree of stochasticity or entropy or whatever you want to call it, which is you can find within ranges of probability, but you can't say determine. You can kind of model, but you can't get.
and you having said that, we should add and that one thing people argue oftentimes, I was mentioning this before, is regarding the chaotic principle, that is somehow representative of an autonomous system, which it is not. Uh,
No.
so people will come at me with what they regard as the knockdown argument. Oh, you couldn't have predicted that, eh? I mean, this has nothing to do with notions of are you actually free from that. That's I guess that's what I'm saying. Obviously,
Right. And
chaos
if
does not mean free from.
right. And if you, I mean, if the bastion of or the last bastion of the independent, I guess if you want to call it that, sense of self, resides within chaos, within the swirling gases of thermodynamics or whatever, or the quantum state of microtubules around the neurons, as there's some interesting people doing stuff in that regard, but if that's where you place the sense of self, then if you're a random occurrence in the purest sense, if you were purely random, uh, then there's really no definition there, right? There's no borders to the self if you're just random chance.
Yeah.
It kind of becomes a nonsensical argument to say like, well, I'm defining something that you can't define. It's so it's very slippery in that sense as well because it becomes moving goalposts. Like, oh no, it's not the the chemical gradients of the synaptic gap. No, it's the quantum tunneling of an electron along the microtubule filaments of the nerve. No, it's if you want to try and find a place for this otherworldly and say that it exists in chaos, then you're really not doing that argument any favors.
A lot of New Age folk, people like Deepak Chopra, they try to. They're not even physicists. I mean, I'm not qualified at all to talk about these subjects of physics, at least. And they'll go on about things like quantum entanglement and displacement and how it relates to eternal truths and weird stuff that just no actual physicists, to my knowledge, would ever talk about. I think there's a danger of, well, for people who still believe in this, the nonsensical, the supernatural, that which lies outside of that which can be measured, trying to find ways of compatibilism, if you will, with those beliefs. But also, I mean, in particular in this regard, people coming at you with arguments taken from physics. Most of them, I assume, are not physicists. I'm not sure they understand these principles any more than I do. Who are saying, well, this is, they'll cite chaos or displacement as well. See, we do have, say, free will, and of course they're talking about the free from. But once again, chaos is not free from. Well, I view it it's part of the complex system,
Right.
essentially. Yeah.
Right, and to say that it is, let's say, the quantum tunneling of an electron in your electron transport chain from the hydroquinone and whatever, if that's where you're putting the sense of self, that would be, in my mind, tantamount to, well, why don't you deify the bacteria in your intestines, right? Because
Right.
they're producing
Well, yeah,
serotonin.
because you can't. I mean, part of. I mean, we can talk about Sapolsky a little bit and his bucket system, right? I mean, essentially, consciousness and self as an emergent property. They're part of a bucket system, right? The bacteria are a bunch of buckets. Your neurons are a bunch of buckets. Everything essentially in your body is a bunch of buckets, and they you can reduce within a bucket certain things, but you can't reduce the whole. I think that's essentially what he was talking about. You can't. I mean, reductionism is a very effective method, but you can't reduce things down to just one thing. And what he would, of course, as you know, in his lectures, argue against it. You have some guy who's a geneticist, the other guy is a behavioral biologist, and the other guy is a neurologist, and they're all having their sort of kumbaya, or rather eureka moment. So I see, this is it, and then we can figure out if this is what's going on here. We've just figured out the human being. And
No, it's more nuanced than that.
I think that's the key here. It's nuance, and people who are looking for some notion of free will in some very specific aspect of human being are missing the picture, or they're not willing to acknowledge, at the very least, your idea of a self, an identity based upon emergent properties and multi-layered complex systems.
Right, and that goes against the reductionistic approach, because if you're trying to look at a network, you can't get rid of the variables that create the network. So I think, unless there's more on this topic, I think hopefully we can move on to
Yeah, I think we've clarified. I mean, I don't really have any serious disagreement with what you said. I said we both agree that, to the extent that we can actually call it that, this notion of self is an emergent property. It's based upon multi-layered complex systems. It can't be reduced to one singular aspect because of the interdependencies, etc. So yeah, we can definitely move on.
right. And now that we've established that, I'm going to reduce it down into one thing. Now, uh, I'm going to talk about one element of
Okay.
the self. I'm
Okay.
not going to say that this is the self, but when I say things like self-esteem, and when I talk about motivation, I'm
Yeah,
looking in a very
and if I
narrow
might briefly, I
focus.
mean, I mentioned this in a previous video that sometimes the artifacts of language are such that we are necessarily constrained about them, and obviously we've just spent almost a half an hour qualifying what we're about to talk about so as to not create confusion, and yet we're still constrained by the limitations of human language and convention within that language. So everyone, hopefully you got the picture, and Sir Biochemist, you have the podium again.
Excellent. Okay, so Mgtow philosophy, the motivation, the sense of self, these things. I think that's an important topic that I would like to discuss, and hopefully share some of my insights with your audience.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is the kind of illusory self, the sense of the constant self. It's more nuanced than that. We just qualified all these things, but now that we've established that, I'd like to make a conversation about the sense of values, right? So the ego and what one's priorities become.
Mm,
And we talked about listening to instincts, right?
right.
Instincts don't necessarily have your best interest in mind in the holistic sense, and we qualified, right? For instance, your instinct to breed, which is a very big thing that a lot of MGTOWs have to come to terms with, is that they are a biological system which has an instinct to breed, more or less. Most of us want children, for instance.
Well, and even here we can distinguish. I think something I stress all the time, and I'm pretty sure the audience understands it, by the difference between the distal and the proximate. I mean, every time some guy is saying, I want to fuck this girl doggy style and blow my load in her, you know, yeah, he's doing it for the sake of the pleasure, but yeah, it's for the purpose of reproduction. So yeah.
Right, and that the pleasure, the oxytocin, the dopamine, the
No,
cocktail,
that just
as we call it.
facilitates the distal cause, the original cause, reproduction. Yeah.
Right, and I think it's interesting, just as an aside, that in order to do something which is just so much work, so many resources that have to go into raising a child, all these things,
Yeah.
it's a horrible deal. And to compensate, your biology is like, wow, that's a pretty horrible deal. I'm gonna have to make it like pure euphoria in order to try and like compel this
Of
person to.
limited duration, because we all know that, for example, the oxytocin cocktail only lasts for so long, and then when the cocktail ceases, or when it's been drained dry, or drunk, or whatever, that's when all these problems in quote unquote relationships and marriages tend to emerge. And I
Right.
get what people call the honeymoon phase, which is just a phase of lots of chemistry.
A phase of blindness, I'd say,
Yeah,
because
or phase of blindness. It's so, and yeah, but it's clear that. Oh, sorry. I want you to continue. Go on.
okay, so the instincts may not have your best interest in mind, and we've established that hopefully. But the idea is that you do have a bit of control. You can modulate your behavior within a range. You're
Absolutely, and that's
still
something
subject.
I've constantly stressed. If I might just rise to my own
Yes, please.
defense, apologia star duskai, if you will. But I think some people have routinely misinterpreted things I've said, such as when I talk about issues of free will and choice, is that you've certainly must have heard me say many times that within that range of variables, there is a lot of wriggle room and things we do have control over. Why would I make a video like my previous one where I talk about reclining, into your thoughts, into the recesses of your brain,
If
of your
that wasn't
mind,
an option.
if that weren't an option precisely? So that's something that's often falsely ascribed to me, and it's just based on pure misunderstanding. Just wanted to mention that.
Good. I think that's. I mean, I feel like we're clarifying a lot of things because
Yeah.
at the beginning I was actually kind of nervous about this conversation because I felt like there was going to be this giant disagreement and I was
Well, I
but
don't. Yeah. I. Hmm. Well, I think it's because, I mean, to briefly once again return to the first part of the conversation, that it's really the conventional notion that gives rise to my views. I've occasionally heard arguments along your sort of reasoning, but it's rare, and it's something that I can at least partially, or even in large degrees, get on board with, because it acknowledges the basis of reality. Whereas, something like a non-defined soul, which is basically what you get with the traditional interpretation of free will. It's nonsense. So, but anyway,
yeah,
moving
and
forward.
we're unfortunately limited by the language in some sense because
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
when I talk about free will, I'm talking about that narrow range of variability of how
That's
much
exactly,
you can modulate.
and then I might be talking about free will. I mean, we're just giving different, yeah. But see, that is not what people usually mean when they talk about free will. They're not talking about modularity within a limited range. They're talking about, as I said, the ethereal I, which doesn't have any meaning. But please go on.
Right. And that range is, I would argue, what the freedom is. And unfortunately, the word freedom is
Is
we're
also a
limited.
bit contaminated, but
Right. And so I would probably, if I wanted
mobility,
to do
mobility. I think mobility is actually better. We can use mobility as a substitute. It's pretty good.
well, in a science kind of context, which I'd like to keep it like
Okay.
as much scientifically centered as I
Okay.
possibly can.
Okay.
Uh, there's a in statistics degrees of freedom.
Hmm.
Right, it's the population size, and I would say the population of choice or the variability of choice.
Okay.
Right, there are certain choices which are not part of the population of choices available to you. Right, you can't. Yeah, today I'm going to jump to the moon. No, that's not an option. I'm sorry. You're gonna have to build a rocket or do something within the laws of physics if you want to go to the moon. You can't just. I mean, that's not a choice, right? You're not free to jump to the moon. That's nonsense. So there is a range. There's a limited range of things which you are able to do, and there may be, uh, how there's an infinite number of points between 1 and 2, right? There's a range, and yes, it may have, if you want to argue, infinite variability within very defined boundaries, right? And the defined boundaries are the laws of physics, and your personal limitations, and right. So that's where I would uh, call free will, right? That limited uh, bound that bounded range of options which are available to you, and some options are not going to be available to you because they will be self-contradictory, in the sense, like, if I didn't like my intestinal flora and I was just like, I'm going to have a complete cleanse, I'm going to kill everything in it, well, that would kill me. I mean, that's a choice. I can choose to kill myself in that way, give myself horrible diarrhea or whatever. But in so doing, I cease to be. Right. That is a choice that doesn't lead to further choices. Right. So there are choices which are also dependent on other choices, previous choices, and such. So uh, hopefully this is making sense, right? Because I
Well, it
do
makes
view it.
perfect sense to me.
Okay. Oh, good. Excellent. Because
I'll have to wait for the confirmation of the audience, though.
yeah, I've tried to explain this to a number of people, but hopefully it's just that they've got superstitious hangups, and it's not a
It
problem.
seems perfectly clear to me. I haven't really missed any points. I'm following, and I think everyone else is as well.
Okay, excellent. So you've got this range, and that's that range of choice, and so I just introduced a whole bunch of words for as far as stochasticity, or the degrees of freedom,
Yeah.
uh,
I think a lot of
population.
people might be familiar with those terms. I mean, uh, I'm not a statistician, but I mean, I know them. So,
Good. Okay, so and now hopefully, like, qualified enough, I think. Uh, so you've got a few choices, and one of those choices is to tamp down on your instincts as much as you can within your range of choices, right? You can choose, like, no, I'm not going to put myself into a situation where I'm going to get uh, horny and then, sleep with the wrong kind of woman and ruin my life, right? You can make certain choices, and sorry, that's established. Now I want to talk about self-esteem, right? And perhaps there's an option of how to look at the self, and I would like to offer up my way of viewing the self, and I realize that some of this is, it's up to personal taste, and it's some of it is a narrative which I tell myself. Some of it is just a story.
well,
Uh,
stories can be illustrative and helpful. So,
right. So I talk to myself. Right. I'm a multifaceted being. I have many aspects to myself. Right. I have an emotional aspect. I have a logical aspect. I've got an aspect of instinct and, gut feelings, I guess you could say. Right. So they're the
aspect of
multifaceted,
pancakes. I know,
multivariate.
like you
Yes,
like pancakes. So,
I love pancakes. So I talk to myself, right, as if there were multiple facets to myself, and in so doing, I'm very affectionate toward myself, right? I want myself to succeed as much as possible, and in this sense, there's an ego investment, if you want to call it that, and I know that that can sound illusory, or the ego death that people strive for, and you had mentioned about the Buddhist philosophy, the idea of
Selflessness, but selflessness not to be conflated with, well, selflessness not in the sense of, well, it is sometimes associated with generosity, but a lack of self, a lack of I. Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
But
thank you. What was the word that you used? I appreciate you coming to the
dukkha.
rescue.
Oh, sorry, that's the Pali language. Dukkha,
Dukkha,
which
thank you.
translates sometimes as suffering or craving, and I mean, to qualify that, maybe I didn't explain it too well in the video. I thought I did, but so the basis in its pure form, and there are different branches of Buddhism. It's the original tradition, the Mahayana. You have the cycle of craving, of suffering, right? It's that life, it seems, or actually based on observation, you can observe this. You can actually get data for this. Is simply based on seeking pleasure. When that pleasure ends, seek the next one, and so on and so forth, and it just sort of repeats until you die. And the question within the context, say, of Buddhism is that all there is? And in the Eastern contemplative tradition, and like I said, I'm not the best meditator. I need to improve. There is some insight in this regard that yes, in fact, not only quite possibly, but there is more than just, I seek my pleasure, it's great, it's ending, next pleasure, and until you drop dead, basically.
The
So
hedonistic treadmill, as I like to
the
call
hedonistic treadmill, if you will, yeah. That there's more. There's actually more to life than merely that. So that's what that was about. Yeah.
it. Thank you. I was struggling to find the word dukkha,
Oh yeah,
and
it's
that
okay.
was
It's fine.
yeah, not my not my background in Buddhist philosophy.
Uh, Not my least officially academic. I mean, I just spent years reading up on the material because it interested me. And there's something, Sam Harris talks about this as well. And some of this information, it just see if those Sam Harris, it'll seem very similar as. But a lot of this I arrived at independently. That Sam Harris is always stressing that there are differences between religions, and that's absolutely true. I mean, you can get almost a complete picture of, or rather, an almost intact picture of some of the core tenets of, say, Buddhist philosophy, the things where the hedonistic treadmill, without any. I mean, there are later on some metaphysical things attached to it that they're obviously not true, or almost obviously not true. But you can get maybe 90% of everything without any of that. Whereas when you look to Western religions, divine revelation, it just doesn't really work. And so, yeah, I was certainly, that's probably why I put more stock in it, because I could see that they were talking about things that actually made sense, where you could actually do some computation in your head and somehow say, yeah, maybe I haven't experienced that, but I can see where certainly everyone understands a hedonistic treadmill, jumping from one pleasure to the next, and then it tanks, and then you go,
Right?
this, yeah,
Uh, Can I offer a biochemistry, a little
yeah,
insight into the hedonistic treadmill?
yeah,
Uh,
sure.
the, there's the idea of activation threshold. In a nerve, there is a certain voltage potential, and
Okay.
in order to fire the nerve, you have to reach a certain threshold. Now, if, for instance, you're in a room with a very pleasant smell, uh, after a while, the smell, it just kind of fades into the back of your consciousness, and you're not really smelling it anymore.
Yeah.
Right? On the first whiff of fresh baked cookies, let's say, you get that, and it has a response, a very strong response. But as you're exposed to the stimuli over and over and over again, the activation threshold has to compensate because the nerves, they're very energy intensive. It requires a lot of energy to maintain that chemical gradient of sodium and potassium ions in order to fire the nerve. So it will try and economize, and it'll increase the activation threshold or increase the amount of stimulus that is required to give you that kind of pleasure of, oh, this smells really great. And so the hedonistic treadmill, in a nervous sense, is that you just have to keep getting more and more stimulated
Oh
in
yeah.
order to feel the same kind of
Yeah, I mean
nervous response.
that's the same. I mean that's true of drug. Well, I mean with drugs. For example, if you take, this is just a useful example, anabolic steroids. You know, and I'm not speaking of my own experience, but rather just in general with people, professional bodybuilders, for example, doing it for years. You start with maybe 250 milligrams of synthetic testosterone a week, and man, that's doing a whole lot for you. You move past a couple of years, and you're on 2 grams a week, and that's what you need to it's because the receptors are no longer responsive, and I think that probably would go hand in hand with what you're talking about.
Yeah,
You,
it's a very similar dynamic. And I'd say that in an overarching sense, I mean, that's a feature of
yeah,
our existence. It's
yeah.
part of the human condition, if you
I
will.
mean,
So,
constantly, stimulating and then having to overstimulate. I mean, that's actually, the whole purpose of weightlifting or so-called bodybuilding is this idea that, you know, breaking past, weight loads that your body's accustomed to, and so on. Of course, there are limitations there, obviously, but yeah. And I mean, getting back to the hedonistic treadmill, yeah, that
oh, this
is.
is the hedonistic
This
treadmill.
is yeah. This is in a nutshell the hedonistic treadmill. So I didn't. Please continue. God, we were talking about dukkha. We were talking. We
Right.
got on this because we were talking about dukkha. Yeah, or the hedonistic
Yes,
treadmill.
and it has a reason, right? The idea of modulating oneself. Once you understand, you don't even have to understand necessarily activation thresholds or potassium gated ion channels of nerves. You don't have to go that deep if you don't want to go. But once you kind of get the idea of let's say dukkha, the idea that pleasures are fleeting, right? You'll need new stimuli, these kinds of things, which is why intellectual pursuits are just so wonderful, right? You get these insights and they build on each other, and right, I think the life of the mind is just it's addicting. I think personally.
Uh, yeah, yeah. It's. I mean, certainly, it's. It has. We'll put it this way. It has more branches to it than almost any other pursuit. I think. You end up. I mean, for example, you could, let's say you're looking up something about, I don't know, Yugoslavia, and then you see mention. I'm actually making a video. We'll be making a video covering something unrelated to what we're talking about now. That is the difference between dialect and language, but neither here nor there. And then you see reference to this, and then you have to click on that, and then you read up on that. And I think, yeah, definitely, I would be in agreement there. The mind or the pursuit of knowledge is kind of the ultimate opiate, if you will.
I'd like to think so, because I'm a fan of it. I love that aha moment, that insight that one gets when things click. It's a
Yeah,
moment of clarity,
yeah.
and yeah, so that's very enjoyable. And so you can find pleasures, for instance, when you know that this is a feature of your existence. You're limited in certain scopes, and that one of them is that you need some motive force. You need some
Absolutely.
you know, if you didn't have enough enjoyment in your life, you're not going to live for very long. I mean, I've been suicidal. I was suicidal as a child, and I know what that's like to not have enough pleasure in one's life. So there is something to be said for seeking out pleasure, because if you don't have it, life becomes rather unbearable.
Yeah.
Uh, but in seeking out the pleasure, you can modulate yourself and direct yourself as best you can toward more healthy pursuits, such as intellectual pursuits, as opposed to, the PUAs who it's never enough. They're never satisfied. They have to bed hotter and hotter
I
women
was
every.
apropos. It's interesting you mentioned this. I was skimming through. I think it's Tommaso Arola. Anyway, the Rational Male, and he was making some comments about Mgtow and how he was trying to encompass say Mgtow philosophy as it's part of the game. I really, it's interesting. These guys don't get that. Many of us, if not most of us, have just checked out of the game, and it's not the game. We're not. We're in a different game, if you will. But I don't think
Right.
they get that. Yeah.
Well, okay, so the pursuit that can be chosen. Right? I mean, you still have to pursue something, and a lot of people have this problem where they feel like their life has no purpose, or they don't feel like they're pursuing anything anymore because
Absolutely. Now that you mention this, I think I mentioned this in the video. I was remembering, yeah, I mentioned this briefly in the video. Karen Strawn, aka Girl Writes What, she told me this story about this guy, right, who became an MRA because his dream was shattered by the legal state of affairs. And what was his
right.
dream? Inseminate a woman and raise his progeny. I mean, and I said in the video that it was pathetic, not in the normal modern English sense, but in the original Greek sense. It was evocative of pity. I thought, this is a serious problem, and I get actually a lot of questions. And this is good you're talking about this about aimlessness. That when all the reproductive stuff is set aside, when you're going your own way, and most of us are likely never going to replicate our genes. I mean, it's possible, but it's unlikely. And we've just kind of moved past that. A lot of people have problems with motivation, and sometimes the motivation is still there, and it still has those channels of the primordial. I think I mentioned that that we talked about money as a means to an end rather than hey, look, I got this money, or what have you, and as a symbol of
Yeah,
status.
when we talked
Think,
earlier the week.
yeah, you're right. And so I think it's going to be very dependent on the individual. I mean, in my case, someone who's always been intellectually curious, and all claims to the contrary notwithstanding, I'm not really a greedy person. I'm not envious of material stuff.
Now, I would disagree with you with that regard because you're very greedy for knowledge.
Well, okay, yes, but I've never in my life, thought, man, this guy's car is a man, fuck him. He's got it's. I remember
Envious.
instances in my youth when, I remember when I first started studying Latin eons ago, over 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago. I was the best student in the class, save for one, this Russian immigrant girl who I think she came to the States when she was about 14 or 15. So she still had a stark accent, but she was better than I was. And I tried to figure out why. And I think retrospectively, she probably was just flat out better. And, her own language in terms of what we call the case system and all these other things. But I remember being, say, 18 or so and being quite envious of her for no other reason that she seemed to surpass me in my abilities there. But I mean, I'm not really at this old age, not really envious anymore of really anything. But never in my life have I felt. But on the other hand, I don't, having let go of a lot of having let go of all the conventional trappings of pursuing the female and the mating rituals. This has been essentially non-problematic to me. I mean, in some sense, yeah, you need to find other reasons. So, do I still? I have to say, I'm probably not as crazy about working out as I used to be, say 10, 8, 9 years ago. But that also has a lot to do with age. I had my hernia, right? Not to go off on a tangent, I'm more cautious, and it's due to prevent atrophy and what have you. Okay, but all these
Yeah, you're more pragmatic
I'm more
about
I'm
working out.
pragmatically motivated rather than motivated with some sort of idealism or, for that matter, primordial instinct. Um, but I never really had a shortage of things that interested me. I mean, I guess in some sense my interests are very limited because I say, well, what are your interests? And I can't cite concrete things like gaming. Like I was just playing a match with my clan before in a shooter, and then there's sort of knowledge. But what does that encompasses just about everything. So I sound really boring to people when I describe that, but yeah. So
If
that's not my.
only they knew.
If
If
only
only they
if only they knew, right? And most of them don't care to know, so I don't bother to tell them. But I think a lot of it's definitely true. I think a lot of men I've seen through PMs and comment they feel this sense of aimlessness because in their case at least the primordial drives were I guess more potent in some sense because for me even when I was a so-called purple pillar, or just not even that, I always just saw, I call what, what I like to call, it's totally unrelated, the Einsteinian loop of insanity. Or, you'd go through one relationship and it fails, and then you
You
just
try the
rinse
same
and
thing.
repeat until you drop dead, basically. And I was saying, why are these fucking people doing this? And why am I doing this? And, and I just, and I still remember my last marriage where I was just so skeptical. I mean, she literally had to beg me to get involved. And I mentioned in that video that she had cheated on me, and it didn't shock me at the time. I did say I was a bit, I wasn't taken back. I guess I was a little disappointed. It's just because I had sort of grown accustomed, and I just even in being in that past relationship, the last one, I just thought this is just all insane. I wasn't even completely on board with it, and so all of that stuff that seems to, I have to admit, I'm odd as a male. I mean, in some ways, I'm very atypical as a male. I mean, I for better or worse, I'm more a man of letters than I am a man of science. That's my background. And even though in later years I've attempted to learn much more about science and to varying degrees of success, that's probably not my forte. And I've never been as sort of materially motivated as it seems. But it's not something I can relate to. And so for me, actually lifting all of that has been a lot easier, I think, in some respect, just because even when I was still doing it, it seemed burdensome. And then there are pragmatic aspects, such as really not feeling anything when having sex with a condom. And that just adds up. And you just, but for other men, I realize it is a huge problem, that aimlessness.
Right.
And, the hobbies. See, I've never really had what I would call a hobby. What is a hobby after all? It's sort of a side pursuit, right? Now, I've always just interested in
Games.
game. Well, yeah, yeah, okay. Gaming is a hobby, fair enough. But pursuing knowledge is just, it's an activity. It's not really a hobby. You're always doing it. I mean, one thing, everything needs an epistemic basis, right? I mean, you have, if you have basic motor reactions, which every human being can engage in or produce. But if you want to learn a sport such as basketball, you have to learn the rules, and you need an epistemic basis for doing that, right?
Right.
So the, it's when you just kind of have hobbies, I think that's when you run into problems, in my observation. And I think most men, not necessarily because that's their natural limitation, just to have, side pursuits, to, play a couple of matches with, shoot some people, and then move on. I think a lot of men tend to have hobbies rather than primary activities just because of time limitations. They're too busy with the primordial, with the instinctive, right? And the
Oh yeah.
hobbies,
I mean,
yeah.
chasing tail takes a lot of time out of your life.
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, as I said, to me, it's always been weird. And so I think one idea that I've thought about in maybe we talk about it here, is that, turn hobbies into actual pursuits. Don't no don't make them side projects, in between, because you're not, if you're going your own way, obviously, in all likelihood, you're not spending your every waking hour chasing tail, or even much time doing that. Hobbies can become something else. And pursuing knowledge, there's so many, as I said, so many branches, so many variants. It's just but I mean, you
Right.
have you have a more precise formula, so why don't you talk more about that?
Yeah, you lucky Stardust, I mean,
Lucky and
the fact that
unlucky.
you were, well, the fact that you were cerebral, it gave you an advantage in
Yeah,
this regard.
I guess I always, I've always been a weirdo in that regard, and I always sucked at sports. I was always, I mean, even though, I, obviously I try to maintain my fitness and stuff. I'm not naturally gifted in that area. I just do it for pragmatic reasons.
Right,
And
but so, oh, go ahead.
and yeah, I just, a lot of the stuff that seems to saddle most, or weigh down on a lot of men. Some of it I can relate to, certainly, but a lot of it just always seem foreign to me. And so in some ways, letting go of that was easier for me. That is true.
So, I mean, because you're lucky, I'm not going to address this thing to you, even though you and I are
And
having a
you shouldn't. You
conversation.
shouldn't. I mean,
Um,
this is not a. I mean, I mention specific cases or talk about myself only to illustrate points, or maybe to add to things. Whether it adds to it or not is up for debate. But
oh, it definitely adds to it because
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
I'm
okay.
going somewhere with this, and
Okay,
I think
but I think this
that
is
you'll.
beneficial to the audience, because there are so many aimless Mgtow men, and it can be, if you're not, I guess, fortunate, and in my case, but never had some of these conventional drives, then yeah, in my case, fortunate, in other cases, not so fortunate. Yeah, there might be a need for a formula, maybe, or a means, a methodology, and maybe you can help them.
Right. So, because you're lucky, this is not addressed to you.
Okay.
This is addressed to the other men who may be having problems finding motivation as MGTOWs,
Yeah.
especially when they're new, and when
Mm.
they're trying to reevaluate. Their system of values has been completely turned on its head. Truths, shibboleths, which they used to hold, have been shattered, and now they have to pick up the pieces and start anew. I would argue, and I mean, this is my suggestion. It's an opinion. I'm biased to it. You do whatever you want. But that hedonistic treadmill, the reason that I brought that up before, and the dukkha and the sense of self, all this, is because there is something to the intellectual pursuit. And I know you and I are biased to this. And I know, I mean, you got called an elitist and all this, but
Yeah.
but the thing is, what is a man? And I don't mean that in the conventional sense. I don't mean like a man is, the no true Scotsman fallacy, where a man beds 50 women, a man drives a really fast car or whatever. No, I mean, what is a man in the philosophic sense? What is a man
A
as
man is a
distinct
leader.
from? Pardon?
No, that's another one. A man is a leader, and women follow.
Right, yeah. So the conventional sense of masculinity, that's something that needs to be reestablished when you have this reevaluation, when you realize, the how things really are, and you take an account of the wasteland of modern dating, I think is what Barbarossa said. And you look
No,
at these
that
facts, you look
actually
at
is my. I'm all for attributing things rightly to Barbarossa. He's a friend of mine, but I referred to it as the wasteland
oh,
of my. Yes, sorry.
I'm sorry.
It's
I'm
okay.
sorry.
It's okay. That is my phrase, though. Yeah.
Okay, so your phrase, excellent, an excellent phrase it is. But so when people make these evaluations, when they look to the evidence and they see where things stand, they see female nature, they see their own nature, they see perhaps their new sense of self, and look at this MGTOW philosophy. There's a lot of reevaluation that has to occur, and one of those things is the sense of masculinity. So, what is a man in the philosophical sense? And I posit that a man, as distinct from, say, a rock or a tree or whatever, or even other animals which share a lot of similarities with us, is that a man is a thing that thinks, right? So the sense of self, yes, there's the individual, right? And you can't take away those parts of you that don't think. You can't take away the gut bacteria, which I guess you could argue that they think, in the sense that they're producing neurotransmitters and they have an agenda. I mean, that's a very, if you want to stretch the term think, yeah, okay, fine. But a man is an entity which thinks, right?
Sentience. Yeah. Yeah.
When you die, for instance, you cease thinking, as far as we're aware. Brain activity stops, right? That's measurable. You cease to be, right? When you stop thinking, you and I know that this is the reductionist talking, and we qualified this for 30 minutes, but you is the as you want to identify yourself, are someone who thinks,
Mm, yeah.
right? And that's what makes you, if you want to say, special, right? As distinct from other things. Because you can have deep thoughts, because you can experience the world and understand it, that allows you masculinity. That allows you a kind of existence which other people who haven't taken to thinking, they're it's the unexamined life which really is not worth living, right? So the instinctual drives, it's not worth living because you're going to end up being a pickup artist, for instance, and you're never going to be satisfied. And you're always going to have to find some other woman to bed every night of the week because it'll never be enough. You'll never be satisfied, right? Your motivation to drive a fast car so that you pick up hot chicks, it'll never be enough. There's always going to be someone richer. There's always going to be someone better looking or whatever, right? So you're always going to have this dukkha, right? But the thing that makes you distinct, if you choose to exit that system and introspect and to think, is that you now have a greater degree of freedom, right? Yeah, as far as the free will goes, what is knowledge? Knowledge is power. It's power to make choices, right? So self-knowledge in that construct is the power to make choices regarding the self. So Mgtow is highly introspective. You have to look at yourself. You have to look at your motivations. You have to look at your drives, your instincts, your desires, right? Where is it that my male mother need is coming from? And of course,
Epistemic
that's
basis. Yeah. I
exactly,
mean, yeah,
exactly.
that's why I stressed in that video, just in a general sense, if to declare yourself autonomous or declare your personal freedom from something, you have to understand what that thing is from which you're declaring the freedom.
Exactly. And that's why it's very important to understand these nuances, which we spent so much time talking about and
Yeah,
qualifying,
yeah,
is because when you understand those things, you can affect change, right? So
yeah,
I can, because I'm a biochemist, but I mean, anyone can do this. I can affect the commensal bacteria in my intestines, because that's the example I keep going back to because uh, established and I don't want to go to a different one, but you can do any number of things, any number of different variables or inputs into
yeah.
your system of self, right? So you can eat well, right? You can take care of yourself. You can uh,
Or you
concern
can do as
yourself
I
with,
did today, splurge and eat lots of shitty junk food, which, that's always the grand mysteries of the universe, eating tons of shit and knowing how bad it is for you, but whatever. Yeah.
well, so that, I mean, that's a modulation, right?
Yeah.
So there's a fluctuation that occurs. You wanted this. The future payoff didn't seem as important to you, right?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So this is something that you have to manage. And when I say you, I'm talking
It's okay.
about
We've
the firm,
established this. It's okay. Just
right?
continue using. Yeah.
So you have to manage this, right? And within the range, you get to manage it, which allows you a greater control over your own happiness, right? So you can choose how to nourish yourself. And I don't just mean food. I don't just mean gut bacteria and that. I mean in a more general sense, right? When I said earlier about how I talk to myself in a very affectionate way, right? I'm in a state of self-soothing or nurturing myself intellectually, personally, emotionally, all of these things. Again, emotions are tools. They're very useful, right? They're a useful servant, but a horrible master. Uh, right? They tell you important
There you go,
things.
guys. If there were ever a Mgtow phrase, and it's not my phrase, it's his. Emotions are a useful servant, but a horrible master. That's got to go down in the Book of Immortal Saws. That is an immortal saw, and I bear witness to it. Ascribes to the High Lord Biochemist.
Thank you. Okay, so this is where I think happiness and motivation can reside, right? Because men, sorry, men, wow, the language, it's insidious how it gets in there. People, no, I mean men. Men had outsourced their care, their nurturing, their sense of love or affection or whatever, uh, to this male mother, need to romance, to women, to the feminine divine or whatever the BS is, when in fact, if they wanted affection, if they wanted that as part of their nature, if there was some drive, right? There's a strong biological reason to want affection and love and all these things. It's very good for your biology to, I mean, like to take care of yourself, to be taken care of, Yeah, of course that's good. That improves homeostasis, right? It improves your sense of self. But don't direct it toward women. Direct it toward yourself, right? And so this self-love, this self-nurturing, this pleasure that you can seek within your mind, within mental pursuits, through hobbies maybe, but in, like you were saying, the more, sorry, how did you say it? Not
Well,
not
I
just
think
hobbies.
I think I mean, you can just call it the enterprise of epistemology, right? I mean, seeking knowledge, seeking essentially. That encompasses so much. It can range from biochemistry to learning about Cicero to whatever.
Or
It's
language.
or language.
Language,
Well, yeah. I mean, it's vast.
huge.
It's vast. It's vast. So yeah, I mean, the epistemic pathway or path, if you will. And I think in some way, for me at least, I think Mgtow is sort of coterminous with that. I think it's difficult. I mean, I wouldn't even on it on the most minimalistic level. And being aware, for example, of legal risks within marriage. I mean, that represents some sort of epistemic model in your head. Here we have this risk and da da da. And at least for me, going further down the metaphorical rabbit hole was just an inevitability. But yeah, I think you're making some good points there. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate. It's not necessarily my actual view, but
Please do.
a lot of
Please.
people would say, well, High Lord biochemist, that's all well and good, but that's not the kind of affection that they want. Yeah, you can treat yourself to pancakes with butter and syrup all you want, but that's not going to be like a blowjob. That's not going to give them the oxytocin cocktail. Da 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 da. And
Right.
and to the best of my knowledge, that won't give you an oxytocin cocktail. Maybe I'm wrong
Well,
about that. I don't know, but so this is just me being the devil's advocate.
no, excellent.
And
Recourse through discourse. Obviously, go your own way so that we can arrive at
yeah,
truth.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Recourse. But so, in go ahead if
Yeah,
there's more.
and I mean, this is part of the whole. It's only human, and so therefore you should do it, and da da da, and so
It's only human. Well, you already made the counter argument
yeah,
to that.
yeah,
The virtue as that which is natural, or
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and then if you want to, you can throw in some. Is it Goethe? Is that how you say it?
Goethe, yeah. What about
Uh,
Goethe?
that which is unnatural is too natural, right? So
Yeah.
if you want a blowjob, what's to say that you can't get a blowjob from a robot, right? What's to say that you need the naturalistic blowjob? I mean, if we're going there, what's
If
to
we're
say?
going there, but once again, these people would say, but oxytocin is important because it helps create bonds, and then the importance of social relationships, and blah
Okay,
blah blah.
bonds to what?
Well,
Bonds
that's
to
the whole thing. I mean, I think we're getting closer. Is that
right? Why not?
it all goes back to that reproduction thing, right? That it all sort of when we talk about these chemicals and the sex act or the rituals involved that lead up to it or what have you. That's just part of reproduction, and I
So
mean that's
why can't
the arguments made in favor of that are really only valid if that is your primary motivation, and if you're going your own way, it's unlikely that it is, right?
right? But not everyone has committed to the path, and
Sure.
and again, you're a lucky Stardust.
In
I don't
some
want to throw
regards,
any
yes, in others not so. In this regard, perhaps I'm somewhat luckier than many. It's true.
right. So, I mean, the devil's advocate, yeah, that's very important here because,
Well, it's certainly
that's
not my view. You're not going to see
no, no,
me actually.
yeah,
But man, you need your oxytocin. No, no,
uh, no. But if you want oxytocin, if you want affection, you know, uh, I put it to you, what if hypothetically you love yourself, right? What if when you look at the face of another, let's say you're looking at the mirror, right? What says that it has to be a woman, right?
or for that
Uh,
matter, I mean, if we're talking, I mean, Mgtow often speak of future advancements. I mean, oxytocin, a capsule. We get if you want your oxytocin, get your fix. You don't need to. I mean, I'm all for that kind of thing. why not? If it doesn't have any side effects, that is.
Or you might end up imprinting on things you may not want to imprint on,
Well, yeah,
unless, of course,
exactly.
you're very controlled in your
Yeah, I mean,
dosing of oxytocin.
yeah. I mean, drugs are, drugs for a reason.
Right.
But
So, I mean, there are any number of different solutions if that's what you want. And the thing is, it is contingent on what you want, but you have to manage what you want. And again, you look at the evidence, and all of these virtues that men in the blue pill world, or me in the past, obviously, I used to ascribe virtues to women that they simply don't possess. Women are far less inclined to have this kind of philosophical conversation. If
uh,
in a
yeah, you might spend a couple of decades looking for someone, a woman who actually can have this kind of conversation, or is rather inclined to. I think there are actually probably more women that have a capacity that is they could, but very very few I note are actually inclined to
Yes,
it.
but then you're dividing capacity and desire. You can't
Well,
divide.
it's I yeah, it's well that's always right, chicken or the egg. I don't know. It's a very difficult thing. I mean that's a conversation into itself. I mean I've often thought about in the context of for a male, relatively poor ability at mathematics, and is it because I lacked a desire, or is it because I just lack ability? Is it both? So that's a different conversation. But let's just say that the two are more or less the same. No, you're not gonna. It's very, very, very rare,
Right.
extremely rare.
And you look at frontiersmen, right? You look at explorers.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a very gendered pursuit, right? The pursuit of knowledge is in many ways a frontier. It's, I would say, one of the best frontiers, but there are all kinds of frontiers to explore and to get your aha fix, your hedonistic treadmill pleasure going on, right? Because when you're exploring new things, it it really is that there is a new stimuli, right? And so you get this activation threshold again, but in a new and different way, right? So exploration allows you to have, I would say, a more sustained uh, pleasure in life. And I would argue that mental pursuits, being intellectual, is one of
Or
the
being
most
elitist. Sorry.
being elitist, you bastard. Yeah, it is more sustainable, and it has a lot of advantages to it because if you're, let's say, a man who's weighing your options and you really want to leave a legacy, what is going to leave a bigger legacy in your mind, or what do you think leaves a bigger legacy? Mimetics or genetics, or right to boil it
Yeah,
down into
I'm myself. I'm not really a fan of legacies, but yeah, certainly I think mimetics are more important than genetics in this regard.
again not addressed here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's hard. There you go. The ego of the self, right? It just kind of. But I just had, I'm.
But no, that's good perspective though, because I mean that's the view from the other side, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Once you get to Stardust level of Mgtow, right?
Which is
The,
not as another conflation I want to mention for the audience is that my whatever you want to call it, I was accused. It was accusatory tone of praising Barbarossa's sexual prowess, and in fact, I was simply citing it as someone who goes his own way in a different way than me, and how my way of going about things is not the dictum or the way that you have to. I mean, it's just people are different. Men going their way do manifest or manifest themselves in different ways, and so
okay.
um,
And I would also add to that people sometimes have a hard time with description versus prescription, right? It's
absolutely, there's if anything, the YouTube business, if you want to call it that. I mean, been making videos for a couple of years now. The level of confusion between description and prescription Yeah, I mean that is probably hit the nail on the head. Maybe the most central point. I mean, people think you say something, you describe something, that means that that's what you're supposed to do, or that's the way it is. Probably
Right. That's
second
the.
in by an
Go ahead.
almost just a total lack of desire to actually understand what you're trying to say. I'm not, setting aside language barriers in the cases of people whose English, for whom English isn't the first language, what have you. But it's just mind-boggling where I'll get situations where I see comments that seem to have absolutely nothing to do with the video. In some cases they don't even watch the video, but if they have watched the video, it's just they'll focus on a word and it has no, it's sort of floating in the nebula, and I'm just thinking, so yeah, there's a lot of that. And one thing I've had to come to terms with, and being a content producer, I think, is that people are inevitably going to misunderstand you. And you can, I mean, I don't want to bring this up directly, but I think when I talked about marketing in Mgtow, that I made myself very clear, I enunciated my points, and I saw just so much conflation and so much, it seemed, willful misunderstanding. And, at this point in time, I just realized that people are just, for whatever reason, they're not going to understand all your points, no matter what the content is. I just made a reference to that as the most recent example.
Right.
Uh,
So,
and Go on.
well, there is. I would agree. This just rank projection or reaction formation or
Hmm.
whatever the psychology going on that motivates these people. There's a lot of that going on.
And look,
But it,
you mentioned yourself triage, right? I mean, this is certainly not your term, but you've used in the. I mean,
save them all.
you can't save them all. And I mean, even say I'm not a God, I mean, I'm not a savior. I'm just a guy who makes videos. It sounds so odd to say that, but I mean, I certainly want videos that or content that is interesting to my audience. But I mean, I don't want to compromise that that network of systems that makes up Stardust, that I in the process, and I don't want to sort of betray myself in the process. So I'm willing to take some hits in lack of understanding, and I don't need or subs or whatever, for the sake of trying to be true to my emergent system of I-ness, if you will. And
Uh,
yeah, but that thing probably is the worst of it all. You describing something means that you're somehow pro, and you see this a lot in the political debates. If you describe something that, say, a system of government that might be considered left wing or big government, then because you've described it, right, that makes you an acolyte or somehow a follower of that system or involved in it. And yeah, I think it's really fascinating to see I how little people actually want to understand sometimes, or in this case, men.
well, there's a lot feeding into their systems
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. And I think at its core, ideally, I guess this is me prescribing again. No, but this is how I feel. This is my perception, or rather my approach. That MGTOW is about peeling away all of those useless layers and just trying to get at the core of things and trying to understand your own motivation, the motivation of other people. And the things we're talking about, that is a difficult it's an almost impossible conversation to have with women, and it's even quite difficult to have with a lot of men,
Right.
even men going their own way. And
Yeah.
it's I, I think getting past the things you talked about, the pursuit of knowledge, it's something that you have to have if you're going to go your own way. Because if you don't, the things I talked about in my previous video, that anger, right? I mean, this guy Mike Menzer, who was a deceased bodybuilder, he used to say, you can't. He had this whole system of sort of short, intense workouts. He said, you can't sprint a mile. Sorry, yeah, you can't sprint a mile, and you can run on these intense emotions for a little while, but you're going to burn out eventually.
Right.
What you want is something that at least leads to some greater sense of equilibrium.
And
Certainly, you want
that
positive.
comes with introspection. I just want to
Yeah,
throw that
yeah,
out for the other
yeah,
men.
yeah,
It's not revelation or revelatory that Stardust. I mean, he has all this knowledge. It can come to you through a process of introspection. You look at your own self, your own motivations, how you've been in the past, etc. You see these, to piggyback off of what you were saying, the intense emotions, right? You can look in your own life and see how that's worked out for you.
yeah. And for me, I mean, I know what it used to be like. I mean, yeah, you feel quote unquote alive. You feel like you're, riding on the back of Moby Dick and all this action is going on, and it's crazy. But you look also to the destructive aspect, and yeah, I mean, do I feel these intense bouts of almost call them jolts of sort of energy that I used to? Probably not, but I'm a lot better off because I have sort of a. I mean, you can kind of describe it in terms of peaks, where I'm in a higher up place, but I'm stable as opposed to just I'm all the way at the top and I'm all the way at the bottom, and I think that that's a really difficult thing to let go of in the context of going your own way,
Mm.
because those are the kind of those peaks, those emotional peaks, which I think ultimately are destructive, are highly sought after by human beings, and in particular by men.
And I don't think they're modulated. I think
And
that they're
exactly, yeah,
just
they're just there. They're just instinct. They're just the
automatic.
desire to have them rather is just instinct. So they're not the product of modulated behavior, if that's what you're implying. They're just
Right. Or in the sense, like, maybe the modulation would be kind of this throwing fuel on the fire kind of thing. Or like
yeah,
adding
yeah,
drama to your life.
exactly. And I think that is very difficult. I think once again, this is not me being a dictator. I just I think there are a lot. I get a lot of feel oftentimes that there are a lot of men that I seem me as a kind of a bit inscrutable to, and that's why they call me an elite. I mean, I'm just me. I'm that sort of complex system of multi-layered complex systems that makes me. I can't not be the way I am, and if people perceive that as sort of a kind of elitism, well, I mean, I can't. I have to live with that. But I'm almost 100% sure in every case that these unmodulated peaks that a lot of men still grapple onto, that they're more destructive than they are beneficial, and that this kind of introspection really is an absolute requirement. You can't you can't get to a place of peace, to a place of inner peace, a better place, if you will, or in your description, self affection, personal
Yeah.
affection. Without that, you're just gonna, you're gonna burn out, and that's why I think Mgtow has to be a lot more than just, well, marriage is dangerous and the legal system is against you. Okay, yeah, but
Right, that's drama right there.
yeah,
I mean, that's the unmodulated peaks, right?
yeah,
You do something crazy like, "Oh, let's get hitched," kind of thing. That's drama. Those are those peaks. People seeking out the next high and like, well, okay, the relationship isn't good enough, so well, let's get married. Even though that's a horrible idea, and they did not introspect before making that decision. And
yeah,
that's the key, is they haven't had the introspection to say, wait, just take a step back. Is this a good idea or not? And you look at these men who get married and go through the meat grinder. Unfortunately, they did not choose to introspect, and it came back and it bit them in the ass, right? And so, with the sense of peace, I guess, but self-affection or enjoyment, pleasure in life, whatever you want to call it, you know, it is, uh, again, the unexamined life is simply not worth living. because
Yeah.
you'll end up in these
And the
situations through
autopilot
these
life is
peaks.
the unexamined life. And I think all of
Right.
us, to varying degree, I mean, we're all on some level still running on autopilot, but even in going your own way, obviously still. But it's really the degree that matters. And I mean, I'm not saying that doing this is going to, create a solution for every issue or problem you have in your life. And we talk about future choices, career, blah blah. I mean, but certainly the things, at least in my case, that did plague me previously the most, that made me the most miserable, that created these unnecessary peaks and then cataclysmic drops below sea level. I mean, that's all gone. And it just came about through introspection. It's just thinking about my own actions, the actions of others, removing myself from the angry sphere, and just seeing that all that is pretty much a waste of time.
And
That
when you oh, go ahead.
no, I'm done.
When you realize that, that allows you to have a more sustained, I guess, I I'm a fan of Jonathan Haid's happiness hypothesis, which I'd recommend it to you, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
recommend it to some of your listeners as well, because there's a wonderful metaphor that goes throughout the book of an elephant and a rider. The prefrontal cortex as this rider on top of this giant elephant, right? And it has a little bit of control. It can kind of steer the elephant, but if the elephant wants to go somewhere, it's going to go somewhere,
Mm.
right? So, but in the happiness hypothesis, Jonathan Haidt, he says that happiness, and I'm oversimplifying a huge chunk of the book here, is a sense that things are getting better, right? If, let's say, and this is a very common example which he uses in the book, that if you win the lottery, you have reached the heights of ecstasy. There's nothing better than winning the lottery. The high, it's just pure elation. Like all of the possibilities now open up to you. It's just a rush. And it turns out 6 months out, these people are miserable, right? They've seen this peak and now they're just like, I need a support system for people who won the lottery. And people from the outside looking in will be like, what? You won the lottery. Why are you depressed? Well, it turns out all these people come out from the woodworks asking you for money, etc., etc., and it doesn't really change who you are, right? The heights of elation. Well, now you've seen the top of the mountain, and everything else is just kind of boring, right?
Mm.
And so there's this lust for the newer heights, and so they end up spending a lot of their money too in this ecstasy. And conversely, you look at the other side of things. You look at people who have become paraplegics, they're quadriplegics, let's say. And Jonathan Haidt, he looks at happiness inventories of people who've been horribly injured
Mm.
or for whatever reason become immobilized. 6 months out, they're like, God, I conquered this. I can conquer anything. Like, yeah, I lost my mobility, but I'm still alive, and I'm gonna write that book. I'm gonna see what I want to see. I'm gonna learn. I'm gonna have good relationships. All these things that whatever they wanted before they had their injury, they're like, I'm even more resolved to do it because I'm a fighter and I can survive. And I can do this. I've seen the lowest lows, and it turns out my life is not that bad because
Mm.
I survived. Even though previous 6 months they're horrible. I mean they're having to adjust and make accommodations for themselves. But there's this strange juxtaposition of happiness. This
I'm not a huge fan of the word happiness, but I like peace of mind. It's just something that I think as long as you're playing the game, as the PUAs like to refer to it, it's probably going to elude you. I mean,
right,
because you got to get back on the treadmill,
right.
and actually the treadmill never shuts off. So you're kind of stuck there, and you're going to run out of energy at some point in time.
But then so now that we understand this, you can take a step back and get kind of meta with pleasure seeking behavior. You can
Mm.
look at it in a more holistic sense. Like, okay, now that I've stepped off the treadmill, I can look at what I was doing and like, oh, this was all drama. It didn't work out for me. All of these realizations, which arguably bring men to Mgtow in the first place. is their first step off of the treadmill, and they realize, well, this drama, I mean, it ruined my life. I lost half my stuff, uh, and etc. It allows you to take stock of what makes you happy, and then you can make a more gradual ascent, I guess you would say, a gradual sense that things are getting better. And I do that personally through greater knowledge, right? Learning. The more capable I am, the better I feel, right? I can look at what I'm capable of doing, and I'm like, wow, I'm pretty fantastic. So
Yeah, and on a final note, as in regards to that, I mean, I think the other aspect of it is, depending on what sort of man you are, I guess, of course, when you're still running on the treadmill, the blue pill thing, what have you, whatever you want to call it, even if you are not naturally inclined to, say, the traditional success model, I mean, you still have niggling doubts. And I think one thing that just completely disappears is, who cares that you're not doing whatever X, Y, Z, and those niggling doubts, you should be doing X, right? No, I mean, that
you
just
don't
goes
have to do
away.
anything.
You don't exactly don't have to do anything. So I think that might be, that singular phrase or sentence might be the most liberating thing that can come of all of this. Is you don't have to do any of this. It's
Mgtow, you don't have to do anything.
Mgtow. You don't have to do any of this. Mgtow. So it's yeah, that probably is probably the most potent statement you could make. I mean, certainly you would have to unwrap it for people who are new to it, but yeah, I think that encapsulates everything we've been talking about
It's
for the
very
audience.
nuanced too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in closing, any final thoughts on your end?
Well, I mean, there are always thoughts, right? There are thoughts until
Right.
we
We
die, but
keep going. Right.
I think
A
I think
man is something.
we've
Go ahead.
talked about yeah, I think we've covered pretty much everything. I was able to offer a few clarifications on certain things, and I think you described your model quite well to the audience.
I would hope so.
And yeah, I think we're good to go. So I hope you
Excellent.
guys enjoyed this talk. I'm fairly sure we can make them somewhat periodic. Maybe even I can get other people on board. I don't know, but I talk to my friend here, the biochemist, reasonably often. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was intellectually profitable, and I'm looking forward to reading some of the comments and reading tons and tons of deliberate misunderstanding. Not just kidding. Just kidding. No, I know.
Eh,
I think the people who are going to tune into this are not going to be the ones who deliberately misunderstand. So
Right. A lot of endurance to get through
it's gonna an
40
hour
minutes.
and 40 or some odd minutes. So yeah, there you go.
Eh, Real quick, can I
Hmm.
just say,
Yes.
uh, I appreciate everyone's patience. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening to Stardust and I talk.
Stardust and me. It's an object
Start.
case.
Uh,
Sorry. I'm
See,
sorry to have to publicly say that, but
no,
this
no,
drives me
no. That's
crazy.
good. That's
Stardust and me. Yeah, it is an object, not a subject. Speaking of objects and subjects, but anyway, yeah. So yeah,
mastery of language. Very good.
yeah. Okay, so we will, imagine, check you guys out at a later date. I hope you enjoy this format. And actually, if you do enjoy this format, let me know. I might be able to bring it about more frequently, even with some other people. And yeah, so just let me know in the comment section. Until the
And I
next
hope this
time.
was.
Oh,
I hope this was helpful for
oh yes, and
you
I
may
hope
have
this was
had
helpful.
trouble
My friend's model and methodology. I think a big part of it was that approach. And me actually listening to it as well, even though I'm a bit weird in that regard, that I'm different. But okay, enough rambling. We are done.
Sorry.
So
Yes.
thanks for watching, guys, or listening rather, and we will see you guys the next time. As always, may the gods watch over you.